Good afternoon and welcome to this week's Oxford Analytica video briefing. I'm Stephanie Hare. I'm the Senior Analyst for Western Europe, and I'm in conversation today with my colleague Chris Oates, who is our North America Analyst. Chris, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We are talking about the reform of the NSA,
Yes.
which was announced on Friday by President Barack Obama. Can you talk us through what needs to be reformed and whether or not you think the reform will work?
So on Friday, President Obama announced a few different reforms to the National Security Agency and to the United States' spying and surveillance methods overall. First one being that he will not spy on allied heads of state or government. This is obviously in response to the disclosures that the NSA had been monitoring Angela Merkel's phone for a while, the German chancellor. Now that is obviously going to play very well in the capitals of allied heads of state and government, although the extent to which it goes down from the top will be up for debate. And I'm sure there are various ministers around Europe and in Asia who will also want to have immunity from possible surveillance. The second one, and the one that is perhaps most relevant to businesses, is that the United States will reform its bulk phone metadata program. Now this is one of the first things to come out in Glenn Greenwald and Edward Snowden's revelations and disclosures, that the NSA had been keeping the data of the phone time, place, and numbers on either end of millions, hundreds of millions of phone calls in the United States. That led to the fears about mass surveillance and spying. Now that will be reformed according to the president, and one way that he'll do it is possibly that the government will not hold all of this data. There'll be a third party that outsources it to. That obviously has tremendous complications, the security of that third party, whether that third party is more secure or less secure than the government. So that will still be ongoing. That will lead into congressional reforms. And then the third is that he has ordered the Attorney General to look into various privacy and transparency controls for non-US citizens.
Is this going to be enough to put people's minds at ease?
Well, likely not. And that was the response of various tech firms immediately afterwards. 8 of the largest who have started a lobby group against this type of internet surveillance put out a statement almost immediately afterwards saying that while the president was making moves in the right direction, according to them, he was only addressing the phone metadata program, not the fact that the United States had been asking private security companies such as Google, such as Facebook, for information requests. They would like something to move on that. And the reason that for them this is very important is that their business relies on non-Americans providing them data. I mean, Google is a very large company in the United States, and the United States is a very large market for the tech industry, but they would much rather have the entire world as a possible market rather than be constrained at the US borders. So for them, what Google and Facebook especially were concerned about is that the president, in justifying these surveillance techniques, because remember, he was also talking to the intelligence community, various intelligence officers who were concerned that these reforms might curtail their jobs. And so to reassure them and to reassure the public that this wasn't an untoward thing, he said that private firms also did something very similar. If you log onto Gmail or Facebook and you see those advertisements on the side of the screen, they target those advertisements to you by trawling through your data algorithmically and trying to figure out what ad would be best suited for you. And he compared that to what the NSA does, trawls through data, looks for patterns, and tries to identify that. They did not really appreciate being compared to the NSA because for them, what they're relying on is perception of their consumer base. It is very difficult for a consumer in Brazil or Germany or the United Kingdom to know exactly all of the policies of privacy and transparency that Google or Facebook do. They have to make a decision. Do they feel their privacy is protected if they sign up for Gmail or not? Should they go to a different firm? So Microsoft today announced that they will be protecting their data of their consumers with servers in different parts of the world, because that is something that they must have thought will get them more consumers. It is a good PR piece. It tells consumers that your data, not only is it protected because we have this privacy statement, but also the servers are in a different country. Now Google's worried about that because if that happens, it raises costs, and it will lead to what they've called the balkanization of the internet. They're concerned about that not only for their own business models, but also for the business model of the internet in general. They're concerned that startups will have a very tough time making it if they can only really start up in their own country, and the costs of having servers around the world are too high. So those are some of the things that the tech industry especially is going to be keen to watch on. And it's not only Google and Facebook that are interested in this, it's the industry in general. The think tank in Washington has estimated that over the next 3 years, cloud computing firms could lose $35 billion, which is a serious part of their potential profits. And one cloud computing firm in Switzerland, which is perceived to be under much different data rules, it may or may not be, it's still very unclear at this point, saw their business go up 40% after Edward Snowden's disclosures. So the perceptions of consumers are going to be just as important to these firms and to the president and those advocating for and against reform as what the reality is, because as with many intelligence issues, it's very difficult to get what is actually going on given their secretive nature.
And I think there's also the question of whether or not it's really up to the United States government alone to reform. Because there's obviously going to be a response of the tech companies. They're hardly going to remain passive. We know they're already upping their encryption because it wasn't, of course, just the government asking them for information. They were also taking the information without the companies even being aware of it. So there's that response. And then there's the response of other governments. So here in the European Union, we're going to be looking at a new data protection legislation that will be passing through probably in 2015. Very highly contested, and a real lack of trust. We've seen moves in Brazil, we've seen moves in the United Nations, and we've just had announced today that there's going to be a panel formed here in Europe studying internet governance for the next 2 years. You know, this is, it's been sort of framed as an American question due to the dominance of the firms and the government who's been caught doing the spying, though of course other governments, including those here in Europe, have been doing it as well. But there's this bigger question, I think, of what is the internet for? Who is it for? And how do we regulate it without killing it? Because it's such a great growth potential.
And I think this is possibly one of the larger historical implications of Edward Snowden and these leaks, is that it may be the first time where people start to realize that cyberspace is really a metaphor. Your data does not exist in the cloud, even though we've given it that term. It exists on servers that are in physical locations, and those locations are subject to laws of the countries that they're in. And we're starting to get a movement from the somewhat laissez-faire style of we trust these internet firms because we have no reason not to people starting to ask questions and governments starting to make regulations and moves and legislations. And I think what the tech firms are concerned about is that the model of the internet, which has been what we've been accustomed to, may start to shift over the next 4 to 5 years. And I think it's something that they're going to be looking for their profits, but also for what they believe is, as you said, one of the biggest growth potentials in the next 10, 20 years.
Lots of challenges and lots of opportunities. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week.